I made a previous video on why China will not become the world's superpower, why in its current form it will not replace the US as the world's superpower. It will merely be one amongst many superpowers, if that's anything to call a consolation. But what I wanted to do now was actually show my sources, which I did not previously do. And one of the main things is I want to show that it's mostly financial reasons why China will not overtake the US in its current form. And I wanted to quote one part of an article from Financial Times, and it says, "Yet Mr. Xi has specifically turned his back on 4 useful allies: the rule of law and an independent judiciary, which is essential for businesses and private sector confidence, a free press, for example, to help expose corruption or abuse of the environment, civil society, from where ideas, innovation and pressure flow, and some sort of political accountability, to encourage officials to work for the benefit of the people and not of themselves or the party, and risk leading eventually to a pluralist system, undermining one-party rule, so the CCP rejects them." The point behind this paragraph is that for China's growth to continue, and in previous decades and until recently, China's GDP growth was actually around 10% a year. Now it's forecasted to grow at roughly 6%, but even that is slowly getting downgraded. And the main point behind this is that as China develops, as it starts growing, as it starts relying more on consumer-led growth, it's actually going to need internal growth. Right now, China is able to grow because it borrows technology from the rest of the world. Currently, for companies to set up shop in China, they have to share their trade secrets. China then uses these trade secrets and it develops its own technology. But the thing is, it can only do this from companies that have superior technologies. But as China starts catching up and as it approaches the line, as it approaches the technology frontier, it's going to need its own R&D. It can no longer borrow from the rest of the world. But the thing is, for that R&D to grow, it has to have freedoms. But currently those freedoms are getting suppressed by the government. And I'll read another quote. "The costs China bears today are small compared with those it would need to shoulder for decades as a superpower. Its military expenditure falls far short of America's. Domestically, the costs of repression and stability are said to be even greater than the budget of the People's Liberation Army. An aging population of 1.4 billion requires a comprehensive social security system. The costs of rectifying the environment are mind-boggling." So yes, numbers are not attached in this paragraph, but the point is that currently China can enjoy lower costs because it borrows from the rest of the world. It borrows innovation from the rest of the world. It doesn't have to do that R&D itself. But the point is, for China to start doing R&D and to start investing in technology to then get ahead of the curve, that then requires more political freedoms. And the reason it requires more political freedoms is that it requires more freedoms by people. They have to be able to do more things. And in the process of being freer in general, they're going to require more political representation. Currently, Chinese people don't mind not having as much political representation and being represented by one political party because that political party has delivered growth. But the thing is, the CCP in its current form cannot deliver those freedoms because it erodes the power base of the CCP. And so the desire for the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand to stay in power and have absolute control is going to clash with the freedoms and eventually political freedoms people are going to require. They're going to have these freedoms to then develop the R&D, to then think outside of the box, to be able to think in different ways, to then drive economic and ultimately technological growth. And if the Chinese Communist Party stays in power, eventually slower growth will become the norm, as has happened in the past decade. And once that growth starts slowing down to below 1%, then we're going to start seeing problems develop in China. And so following on from that, I'm going to read another quote. "To the factors above can be added a lack of trust by the people in the Chinese Communist Party. Nationalism is an inadequate substitute. To give one example of this lack of trust, consider the institutionalization of the Chinese currency. A superpower must surely have a currency that is freely traded throughout the world. But what would happen if China opened its capital account? Because the people don't trust the party, today's capital flight would become a flood. Investors would abandon the current destination of their savings, the domestic housing market. Its collapse would precipitate a recession and unemployment. And the number one fear of the party is instability caused by unemployment. If you claim credit for all the good things, you also earn discredit for the bad." To this paragraph, I actually want to add the monetary policy trilemma, or simply the policy trilemma. Basically, you have 3 factors. you have independent monetary policy, you have free-flowing capital, and you have exchange rate stability. So the basic idea is that you can have two of these, but you can't have all three. So China has two of these, and has an independent central bank, the People's Bank of China. Check, that's a good thing. Some countries don't have an independent central bank. For example, the Euro area countries designate their monetary policy to the ECB. Fair enough. So China has that. It also has exchange rate stability. That's because China heavily involves itself in the forex market, in the foreign exchange market, and it ensures that the value of the Chinese currency stays stable. Fair enough. But because of those two China has chosen, it cannot have free capital flows. And this is exactly what is referenced in that paragraph. It has capital controls. It does not have free movements of capital. So the point is that the forex market is absolutely huge. It has a daily trading volume of $5.1 trillion. This is far larger than the flow of goods between countries. And the US dollar is currently on one side of 83% of transactions. The US to euro, the US to yen, the US to Australia dollar where I live, etc. The Chinese currency on the other hand is minuscule, but it's because Chinese capital cannot freely flow. So in terms of the policy trilemma for the US, it has an independent central bank and it has free capital flows. Therefore, that means that the value of the US dollar moves around freely according to market forces. Of course, there is some intervention in the forex market by the US government, and in fact, there's evidence that every single nation on the earth has some sort of intervention in the forex market, but it's nowhere near the size of China. So this is another problem for China. For it to replace the US as a superpower, its currency must replace the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and it must become a bigger player on the world stage. But the only way that can happen is if China then allows for more capital flows. But then if China allows free capital flows, it must give up either an independent central bank, which obviously it's not going to do, but then it must allow the value of the Chinese currency to freely float, but it doesn't want to do that. So another factor China must overcome on its road to replace the US as a world superpower is that it must allow more private enterprises, more private businesses that have the freedom to choose how they invest. Currently, the country is dominated by state-owned enterprises, but to quote from another article which says, these sectors, SEOs, are now showing overcapacity and low productivity. Since the 1990s, SOEs have been consolidated through closures and mergers, but this downsizing came to a halt in 2007-2008 when the government rolled out a stimulus program to cushion the effects of the global financial crisis, and finance went into factory constructions and equipment without the demand to meet this supply. SOEs are less profitable than private companies, and the share of loss-making SOEs has been rising since 2010. The banking sector in China is also dominated by SOEs. I was listening recently to a podcast by The Sound of Money, and they were mentioning how it used to be the case that roughly 3% of the banks in China used to be foreign banks, but now that's fallen to 1.5%. And that's partly due to the fact that these banks simply can't compete against the state-owned enterprises, which ultimately of course have the backing of the Chinese government. But what they were mentioning is that this has led to inefficiencies in the Chinese banking sector, and that the banking sector is ultimately stagnant, and that there's been a rise in non-performing loans. The thing is that many loans are simply made by the Chinese Communist Party. They choose where these loans go. It's not made by the private sector, which would then be more efficient in how it allocates loans. And on this front, I'm actually going to quote from another article which says, the most significant problem for China's banking sector, and for the entire financial system during the last decade, was the amount of NPLs, non-performing loans, within state-owned banks, and in particular among the big four banks. Reducing the amount of NPLs to normal levels was a high priority for China's financial system. We mainly rely on official sources for our analysis on NPLs, but we also speculate based on data from non-government sources, including case studies from particular regions or banks. Some of this data and speculations paint a much gloomier picture of the NPLs and China's state-owned banks than the official data suggests. And so for most nations around the world, around 90% of the money supply is created by banks which make loans. And it's the central banks that facilitate this process. And so when the bank creates a loan, it also makes a deposit for that person. And that person can then use that deposit as money. And money is also created as a money debt here. But the point is that the private sector chooses how to allocate its resources. And because these private institutions have to make money, they have to carefully choose how they allocate their money and ultimately how resources are allocated. That's ultimately the point. banks choose how to allocate resources in society. They choose who gets money and how. And those people in turn, of course, have to be efficient in how they use resources. And this is how we get growth. But in China, that's not the case. It's mainly up to the Chinese Communist Party that decides how loans are made. And this is why non-performing loans has been increasing. Some of these loans simply should not be made, but they're made ultimately as political decisions. And this is one factor which is going to hold back China's growth. And in fact, this is what they were saying in the podcast that I was mentioning, The Sound of Money, that it's an embarrassment for the Chinese government that the amount of foreign banks has actually gone down over the years. These are private banks which do not have state support, and they must be efficient in how they allocate resources, and they must be run on a profit motive. But it's evident that they simply cannot compete with the state-owned banks. And this is what I want to drive at with my video. It's these financial factors which will hold China back from being the world's superpower. And this all comes back to the one-party rule which ultimately stifles innovation. This was not a problem up until now because China could borrow technology from the rest of the world. But as China catches up and it needs to do its own innovation, this is going to require eventually more political freedoms, which is going to undermine the Chinese Communist Party. And it's something that it cannot allow. It cannot loosen its grip on power. And for that, Chinese growth will suffer. And this is eventually going to come to a head in the coming decades. For now, 6% or even 5% growth is fine. That's even great. Most developed nations around the world are growing at 2%. And of course, during this coronavirus period, that's going to be lower. But as most nations around the world recover, we can expect the growth to be around 2%. But as China drops below this level, questions are going to be asked about the country, and in particular about one-party rule. And people are going to want more freedom with their money. But as the Communist Party gives people more freedom to do what they want with their money, as was mentioned in the quote before, this is going to cause a capital outflow, and it could cause a flood of capital outflow, which obviously the government doesn't want. And so the only way China can replace the US as the world's superpower is by replacing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the only way it can do that is by opening up its capital account. And people must have faith in the Chinese yuan and ultimately the Chinese institutions. Currently people don't because of the absolute power, the absolute control the Chinese government has over its own people. And that's ultimately why I say the Chinese Communist Party and growth is going to come to a head in the future. So that's all I wanted to say. Hope that's helped. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate and share all of the good stuff. Definitely helps my channel, and I'll see you guys next time.